The trail stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of white winding through the dense, snow-laden forest. The air was painfully cold, each breath like shards of glass scraping down my throat. I'd been hiking for hours, the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground, the only sound breaking the eerie stillness. The solitude was exactly what I'd wanted, a break from the chaos of the city. But out here, surrounded by nothing but snow and silence, that peace had started to feel oppressive. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making every little sound seem amplified. I stopped for a moment to adjust my scarf, glancing behind me. My footprints were the only ones marking the pristine snow, just mine, leading back the way I'd come. I shook off the nagging unease that had been creeping in since I'd entered the forest and started walking again, picking up my pace. It was a few minutes later when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the echo of my own steps. But it wasn't. The rhythm was wrong, too slow, too deliberate. I stopped, and the sound stopped too. I turned around quickly, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing, just the trees, standing tall and silent, their branches heavy with frost. The footprints I'd left earlier stretched back in a single line. There was no one there. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I pressed on, focusing on the crunch of snow beneath my boots. But the sound came again, closer this time. The second set of footsteps. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The forest seemed to close in around me, the towering pines casting long shadows across the snow. Slowly I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was so strong I could almost feel eyes on the back of my neck. That's when I sought faint impressions in the snow that hadn't been there before. The footprints weren't mine. That much I was sure of. They were fresh, crisp against the snow, appearing only a few paces behind where I stood. My own trail was undisturbed, but these, they had come from nowhere. I swallowed hard, the sharp cold biting my throat. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to turn around and head back the way I came. But something kept me rooted in place, a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. I took a step forward, and so did the sound. The crunch of snow was unmistakable, matching mine in perfect rhythm. I spun around again, my breath fogging the air, eyes darting between the trees. Still nothing. Only the forest, dark and silent. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it now, the unmistakable weight of being watched. My fingers curled into fists, the thick gloves doing little to stop the trembling. Hello, my voice sounded small, swallowed by the endless expanse of trees. The echo faded quickly, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the branches. I started walking again, faster this time. The trail was becoming harder to see as snow began to fall, soft and steady. The crunching behind me didn't stop. It followed me. I didn't dare look back. My steps became hurried, stumbling now and then as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever was back there. I told myself it was just an echo, maybe the shifting snow. That's all it could be. But then I heard it again. This time the sound wasn't behind me. It was to my left. My head snapped toward the noise, and I caught a glimpse, just a flicker of movement between the trees. Something dark, too large to be an animal, shifting quickly out of sight. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged bursts as I pushed forward. The trail was disappearing under the falling snow, and I was losing my bearings. The crunching sound grew louder, closer, and I knew, whatever it wasn't going to stop. The sound was relentless now, closing in with every step. My lungs burned from the freezing air, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare stop. The trees around me blurred into shadows as I pushed forward, desperate to find the end of the trail or anything that could save me. The crunching wasn't just behind me anymore. It was everywhere, to my left, to my right, even in front of me. It wasn't possible, but there it was. The sound circled me, deliberate and mocking, as though whatever was following me wanted me to know I couldn't escape. I stumbled, falling hard onto the icy ground. Pain shot through my palms as they hit the snow, but I didn't have time to feel it. I scrambled to my feet, glancing over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. Standing just beyond the line of trees was a figure, barely visible against the swirling snow. Its shape was wrong, too tall, its limbs elongated and unnaturally thin. The head tilted slightly, as if it was observing me, curious. For a moment I couldn't move. My body was frozen, not from the cold, but from the sheer terror of its presence. It didn't make a sound, yet I could feel its intent, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest. Then it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It glided, impossibly fast, closing the distance between us in seconds. I turned and ran, every nerve in my body screaming for survival. The forest was a maze now, the trail completely obscured by the snowfall. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. Behind me, the crunching grew louder, more frenzied. It was right on my heels, and I swore I could feel cold, bony fingers reaching for me. My foot caught on a hidden root, and I went down again, this time hitting my knee hard enough to send a shock of pain through my leg. I looked up, and there it was, standing over me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank void. And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was lying on the floor of a small cabin, its walls rough and wooden, with a single lantern flickering weakly in the corner. The warmth of the room hit me immediately, a sharp contrast to the icy grip of the outdoors. For a moment, I thought it was over a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the cold, but the ache in my knee and the damp chill still clinging to my clothes told me it had been real. I tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through my leg. That's when I noticed the door. It was slightly ajar, snow spilling in around its edges. The room was eerily quiet, except for the faint howl of the wind outside. There was no sign of whoever or whatever had brought me here. My heart began to race as I replayed the events in my mind. The footsteps, the figure, the way it had moved. None of it made sense. My eyes darted around the cabin, searching for any clue as to where I was or who had helped me. On the table near the lantern, there was a steaming cup of tea, untouched, and next to it, a small object. My throat tightened when I realized what it was: a glove. My glove, the one I'd lost when I fell on the trail. The memories came flooding back the way it had stood over me, the empty void where its face should have been. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I reached for the glove. It was cold, far colder than it should have been, as if it had been left outside for hours. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a single, deliberate crunch of snow right outside the door. My breath hitched as I turned toward the sound, the door creaking slightly as the wind pushed against it. I waited, frozen in place, every muscle tense. The silence stretched on, unbearable. And then, slowly, the door began to open. The door creaked open inch by inch, the icy wind slicing through the room. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stared, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness beyond the doorway, and then movement. A shadow stretched across the floor, long and unnatural, bending and twisting as though it had a life of its own. My body refused to move. I was paralyzed, caught between disbelief and sheer terror. The shadow stopped just short of me, pooling at my feet. I couldn't bring myself to look up, but I didn't have to. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted as an overwhelming presence filled the room. It was here. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever was coming. Seconds passed, maybe minutes. The silence was suffocating. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the feeling lifted. The warmth of the room returned, and when I opened my eyes, the door was closed again. The shadow was gone. I sat there for a long time, trembling and unable to make sense of what had happened. When I finally found the strength to stand, I limped to the door and locked it, though I wasn't sure it would do any good. My knee throbbed with every step, but the pain was almost grounding, a reminder that I was still alive. Morning came slowly. The pale light filtered through the frost-covered window, illuminating the small cabin. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world eerily calm. I stepped onto the porch, squinting against the bright reflection of sunlight on snow. The forest stretched out before me, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But as I looked down, my stomach turned. Footprints, dozens of them, circling the cabin in chaotic patterns, their impressions deep and unnervingly fresh. I didn't wait to find out more. I gathered my things and left, limping back down the trail as fast as my injured leg would allow. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that forest. But every winter, when the snow falls heavy and the nights grow long, I can still hear the sound of footsteps behind me. The storm came out of nowhere. What started as a gentle snowfall quickly turned into a blinding blizzard, the kind where even the closest trees became ghostly outlines. I was driving home from visiting my parents, the snow-covered back roads stretching endlessly in front of me. But the heater in my old car was struggling to keep up, and the windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the thick, wet snow. The radio crackled with static before going completely silent, leaving me alone with the sound of the engine and the relentless wind outside. As the blizzard grew worse, I slowed to a crawl, gripping the wheel tightly. The headlights barely penetrated the swirling snow. I told myself to focus, to keep my eyes on the road, but the isolation was suffocating. The entire world had disappeared, swallowed by the storm. That's when I saw a dark figure standing on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was a tree or a sign distorted by the snow. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They weren't waving or moving, just standing there in the blizzard, facing my car. I slowed down even more, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They were dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their head bowed slightly. No hat, no gloves, nothing to shield them from the biting cold. As I drew nearer, the figure raised its head. My stomach dropped. Even through the haze of snow, I could see their face, or rather, the lack of one. It was smooth, featureless, like a blank mask, staring back at me. I hit the brakes instinctively, the tires skidding slightly on the icy road. For a split second, I lost sight of the figure in the storm. When I looked again, they were gone. I sat there, heart pounding, staring into the blizzard. The road was empty, the snow erasing everything like it had never been there. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I wasn't alone on that road. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I sat there, staring into the swirling snow. The storm had swallowed the figure, leaving nothing but the empty road ahead. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. But no matter how much I wanted to believe that, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I eased my foot off the brake, the car creeping forward. The headlights barely illuminated the road, but I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, afraid to glance into the trees lining the sides. Every shadow seemed to shift, moving just out of sight, and the wind howling through the branches sounded almost like whispers. The road felt endless. The snow was piling up fast, and my tires struggled to grip the icy surface. I knew stopping here wasn't an option. I was miles from the nearest town, and the storm was too dangerous to risk getting out. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I glanced to my right, and my breath caught in my throat. There, just beyond the edge of the forest, was the figure. The same tattered clothing, the same unnervingly smooth face, now walking parallel to my car. Panic surged through me. I pressed harder on the gas, but the car barely responded, sliding slightly before regaining traction. I glanced again, and my stomach turned. The figure wasn't walking anymore. It was running, its jerky movements unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Despite the snow and distance, I could feel its attention locked on me, unwavering and unrelenting. My heart pounded as I gripped the wheel, desperate to outrun whatever it was. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the car. My heart stopped. Something had hit the roof, hard enough to shake the entire vehicle. I screamed, my breath fogging up the windshield as I slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, and for a moment there was only silence. And then, slowly, the sound of something dragging itself across the roof began. The sound was slow, deliberate, something heavy scraping across the roof of the car. My breath hitched as I stared at the dashboard, too terrified to look up. Each drag felt like nails on a chalkboard, vibrating through the metal shell that was supposed to protect me. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my mind racing for answers. Was it an animal? A branch from a tree I didn't notice? No. Deep down, I knew it wasn't something so simple. The car rocked slightly, a soft creak following the shifting weight. Whatever was on the roof was moving closer to the driver's side, inch by inch. I couldn't breathe. My pulse thundered in my ears as the windshield began to frost over from the inside, the cold seeping into the car like a living thing. My fingers shook as I fumbled with the ignition, desperate to get the engine roaring and the heater blasting. The dragging sound stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. I dared to glance up, just for a second. Through the thin layer of frost on the windshield, I could see a shadow, a shape crouching low against the car roof. It was larger than I thought, its limbs unnaturally long, splayed out like a spider clinging to its web. And then, it moved again. The shadow shifted toward the driver's side window, slow and deliberate, as though it knew I was watching. I snapped my eyes forward, praying I hadn't given it reason to attack. But it didn't matter. A hand, or what should have been a hand, pressed against the glass. Long, gnarled fingers spread wide, their tips ending in sharp, claw-like points. The skin, if it could be called that, was pale and translucent, with veins twisting beneath like cracks in ice. I gasped, jerking back in my seat as the claw raked down the glass with a screech that made my teeth ache. The car shook violently as the creature slammed against the door. Testing I didn't think. I shoved the gear into drive and floored it, the tires spinning before catching traction. The car lurched forward, but the sound of claws on metal told me it wasn't letting go. I screamed as I drove blindly into the storm, hoping, praying I could outrun it. The snowstorm was unforgiving, blinding, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't think about anything except getting away from whatever had latched onto my car. My heart raced and my hands shook violently on the wheel. The sound of the creature scratching against the roof still echoed in my mind. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the engine roaring in protest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, chasing me. Each glance in the rearview mirror showed nothing but the swirling white of the storm, but I could feel its presence close, too close. A sudden, gut-wrenching thud made me flinch, and the car swerved violently as the tires hit a patch of ice. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was still there, I was sure of it, but I couldn't afford to stop, to look. The only thing that mattered was escaping the storm. As I drove, I could feel the air in the car growing colder, even though the heater was blasting. A chill that cut through to my bones, colder than the outside world. It felt as though the very atmosphere inside the car had turned to ice. I was suffocating, every breath coming out in frosty gasps. Then, without warning, the sound of dragging stopped. The car was silent, too silent. I dared to look up and glance nervously at the rearview mirror. Nothing. The road behind me was empty. The storm continued to rage, but the figure, the shadow, was gone. I didn't know how long I drove, only that I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. But when the snow began to thin and the trees cleared, I saw a sign. A town. I didn't hesitate. I took the first exit, my hands still shaking, my body numb. I parked in front of a small diner, the only sign of life in the empty town. I stumbled out of the car, my legs unsteady, and I rushed inside. The warmth of the diner hit me like a wave, but there was no comfort. The waitress behind the counter looked up from her notepad, her eyes narrowing as she took in my appearance. "Rough night?" she asked, though her tone suggested she'd seen plenty of travelers like me. I nodded, forcing myself to smile. You could say that then. As I sat down and tried to calm my racing heart, I saw it. The door to the diner creaked open, and a cold gust of wind swept in. The woman looked up, but it wasn't until I turned to glance at the door that I saw the shadow, just a flicker of movement, too fast to catch. My stomach dropped. It was back. The shadow lingered just outside the diner door, its outline distorted by the falling snow. I could feel its presence even before I saw it move again, and my pulse quickened. I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, my body tensing as though anticipating the worst. But no one else in the diner seemed to notice. The waitress returned to her cleaning, and the other customers sat obliviously at their tables. I rubbed my eyes, trying to calm the storm inside my head. Maybe it was just my nerves, the aftermath of the storm and the terror I'd felt. It wasn't impossible that I'd imagined the shadow in the corner of my eye, that it was just the storm playing tricks. But I couldn't stop the chill creeping up my spine, or the feeling that the creature was still out there, waiting. I glanced at the door again. The snow had thickened, and the outside world was nothing but a blur of white. I pushed the thought aside and tried to focus on the hot coffee the waitress had set down in front of me. The warmth felt good, but it didn't last. The feeling of being watched returned, intensifying as the minutes stretched on. I reached for my phone, my hand still trembling as I unlocked it. The battery was almost dead, but there was one notification I hadn't seen before. A message. It was from my sister, sent hours ago. "Are you okay?" I saw something strange on the road earlier. A person just standing there in the snow. I swear they had no face. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just a hallucination. My sister had seen the same thing. I looked up again, and this time I could feel the figure's eyes on me. The shadow was closer, almost inside the diner now, but it didn't move. It didn't need to. I didn't wait any longer. I pushed away from the table, nearly knocking over my coffee. The waitress looked up in confusion, but I didn't stop. I bolted out of the diner and into the storm, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran. The snow hit my face, cold and stinging, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. I needed to escape. The sound of footsteps too close, too heavy, followed me as I ran, no matter how fast I moved. The shadow wasn't far behind. The cabin looked perfect at first, a cozy little getaway nestled deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the world. My friends and I had been planning this winter trip for months. We needed a break from the chaos of our lives, and the secluded cabin, surrounded by miles of snow-covered pines, seemed like the perfect place to recharge. When we arrived, the storm had already started. The wind howled through the trees, and the snow fell in thick sheets, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of us. The cabin, old but sturdy, stood alone, tucked into the trees like it had been forgotten by time. Inside, it was warm and inviting. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. We unpacked, settled in, and opened a few bottles of wine to celebrate. Everything felt perfect. But as the night grew darker, the atmosphere began to shift. There was something off about the place, something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't the creaking of the wood, or the occasional gust of wind that rattled the windows. It was a feeling. A weight in the air, as if the house itself was watching us. We laughed it off at first, chalking it up to the isolation and the storm. But then, as the night wore on, strange things started happening. It started with the mirrors. We noticed them fogging up, despite the heat in the room. At first, it was just a little mist, but soon, the fog grew thicker, almost as if someone were standing on the other side, breathing against it. Then the noises started. Soft at first, a scratch here, a creak there, but soon they grew louder. It was as if something or someone was moving around the cabin just out of sight. The fire crackled and popped, casting long shadows across the room. I could have sworn I saw something standing in the corner, but when I looked again, nothing was there. The sense of dread crept in slowly, but once it took hold, there was no shaking it. And then, one of my friends disappeared. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was stifling. My friends and I had gathered around the fire, trying to ignore the strange occurrences that had been escalating all night. The fog on the mirrors, the whispers we thought we heard just beyond the walls, the shadows that moved unnaturally, they were all too much to ignore. But the real fear set in when Amanda went missing. At first, we assumed she'd gone outside to get some fresh air, but as the minutes turned into an hour, we began to worry. The snow was so thick that no one could see more than a few feet in front of them, and the wind had only grown stronger. There was no way she could have gone far without getting lost. We split up, calling her name, our voices barely carrying over the wind. I went to the kitchen, then the hallway, checking every room. I opened the door to the small attic, but it was locked. Maybe she went upstairs, suggested Ben, his voice unsteady. I nodded, though a sinking feeling in my gut told me something was wrong. I made my way to the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each sound echoing in the otherwise silent cabin. When I reached the top, I called out again, but there was no response. The attic door stood at the end of the hallway, but it was ajar, something that hadn't been the case before. I crept closer, feeling the air grow colder with each step. The door swung open on its own, revealing only darkness beyond. I hesitated. But then I heard it, a low, guttural noise. It sounded like a whisper, but the words were indistinguishable. And then, a laugh. I froze. It was Amanda's laugh, but it was distorted, like something someone else was mimicking her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the room plunged into darkness. "Ben," I screamed. "Something's wrong. We need to leave. Now," but when I turned around to go back down the stairs, I saw it. A figure, standing at the bottom of the stairs, its face pale and lifeless, staring up at me with empty eyes. And then, a voice, not Amanda's, but something deeper, darker, spoke. "You should have never come here." I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, frozen in place as the figure at the bottom of the stairs stared up at me with those hollow eyes. The air around me grew cold, colder than any winter night I'd ever felt. It felt like the temperature had dropped to freezing in a matter of seconds, and my breath became visible in the air, thick and misty. The thing at the bottom of the stairs wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. It stood unnaturally still, except for the faint twitching of its fingers, which seemed to beckon me closer. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. It was as if it were trying to speak without a voice. And then it whispered, a voice that seemed to echo from the very walls. "You're too late. She's already ours. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I took a step back, the fear making my movements sluggish. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew no. I felt that I had to get out of there. I spun around trying to run, but something stopped me. It wasn't just the figure at the bottom of the stairs. No, it was the house itself. The walls seemed to close in, the windows fogging up, trapping me inside. The door to the attic slammed shut behind me, and the dark laughter of Amanda, now distorted and otherworldly, rippled through the cabin. Then I heard its footsteps, echoing from behind me, too many, too fast. I turned, eyes wide, but saw nothing. Just the endless darkness of the attic hallway. I ran. I don't remember when I started running, but I bolted down the stairs, pushing past the others who had gathered by the door. Ben was there, his face pale and filled with panic. He tried to grab my arm, but I jerked away, shoving him out of the way. The others weren't far behind, but when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. I yanked the handle, but it felt as if something alive was holding it shut. My breaths were shallow, and the pressure in my chest made it feel like I couldn't breathe. "Please, let me out," I screamed, pulling desperately at the door. Then, with a violent bang, the door flew open, and I stumbled into the snowstorm outside. But when I turned around, I could still hear them. Laughter and footsteps. They were still inside. I didn't stop running. My feet sank into the deep snow, each step pulling me down further, but I didn't care. The storm howled around me, the wind biting through my clothes, stinging my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps, the freezing air burning my lungs. But I couldn't stop. The snowstorm made everything feel distorted. The world around me was a blur of white, and I could barely see my hand in front of my face. But still, I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I could think about was escaping the cursed cabin, escaping whatever had taken hold of it. Whatever had taken hold of my friends. I stumbled through the snow, my legs trembling, my body on the edge of collapse, but I couldn't stop. Then, suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind me snapped me back to reality. They were still following me. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the thick storm, I saw a figure in the distance, pale, skeletal, moving too quickly, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I screamed, but it was swallowed by the wind. I turned back to the path ahead of me, desperate to keep moving, but my vision was starting to blur. The snow and wind made it impossible to see, and I felt like I was running in circles. Not a shape loomed ahead, a tree. I grabbed onto it, trying to steady myself, but when I looked up, I realized the tree wasn't where it should have been. It was out of place, like it had moved. I froze. The figure was closer now, almost upon me. And then I saw something worse. The cabin. It stood at the edge of the forest, its lights flickering, but there was something wrong with it. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, but it was still there, alive, watching me. And inside I saw them. My friends, their faces pale and lifeless, staring out at me from the broken windows. The thing from the bottom of the stairs was standing at the door, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, deeper into the storm, knowing that whatever had claimed that cabin would never let me go. And it never did. The snow was falling heavily that night, each flake swirling in the cold wind as it blanketed the world in white. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, insignificant, like the world itself had swallowed you whole. I had been driving for hours, the road stretching out ahead of me like an endless ribbon. My car, the only thing cutting through the isolation. I had been on a long road trip, heading to visit family for the holidays. But the storm had come out of nowhere, catching me on the highway miles from the nearest town. The roads were slick with ice, and the visibility was almost non-existent. My windshield wipers fought against the heavy snow, but it was a losing battle. I was alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, and the silence inside the car was almost unbearable. That's when I saw a figure standing on the side of the road, half hidden by the blowing snow. I had almost driven past, but something made me slow down. The person dressed in a tattered coat, their face obscured by a scarf, was standing there, motionless. I could barely make out the shape, but I knew they were watching me. I didn't want to stop. The thought of letting someone into my car, especially in the middle of a snowstorm, felt wrong. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something about that figure didn't sit right with me. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there, waiting. I rolled down my window, the cold air biting at my face. "Need a ride?" I called out, my voice cracking from the chill. The person didn't answer immediately. They just stood there, staring at me, their face still hidden beneath layers of fabric. For a moment I thought they hadn't heard me. Then, slowly, they moved forward. "Please," a hoarse voice rasped. "I need your help." I didn't want to open the door, but the desperation in their voice, there was something in it that made me feel like I had no choice. I unlocked the door, and that's when everything went wrong. The moment I unlocked the door, the figure stepped forward with a suddenness that made my heart race. The wind howled outside, and for a second I couldn't see anything but the snow, the darkness swallowing everything around us. I glanced at the passenger seat, unsure if I should let this stranger inside. The cold air bit through the small crack I'd opened in the window, but something about them, how they stood so still, as if frozen to the spot, made me hesitate. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. "Please," the voice rasped again, barely above a whisper. "I've been stranded for hours. The storm. I'm cold. I need your help." I swallowed hard, glancing over my shoulder at the desolate road behind me. The snow was coming down so thick now, it was like being in a dream, one where nothing was real and everything was closing in. I didn't want to be alone out here. I reached over and opened the passenger door. The figure didn't move at first. They just stood there, looking at me, eyes hidden under the hood of their coat. The wind stirred the snow around them, making their figure seem to flicker in and out of sight. "Come on, get in," I said, trying to mask the unease in my voice. They hesitated a moment longer, then slowly, reluctantly, climbed into the car. The moment they sat down, the temperature inside dropped. It was like the warmth of the heater had disappeared. I could feel it, this bone-deep cold that settled into my skin, making my muscles ache. I glanced at the person sitting next to me, expecting to see them shaking from the cold, but they weren't. They were perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, their breath steady. "You okay?" I asked, my voice tight. I didn't know why, but the stillness of the person beside me felt wrong. They didn't answer. Instead, the silence grew heavier, thicker. The air seemed to freeze in the car, and I had to force myself to keep my hands steady on the wheel. I turned my gaze toward them again, but this time something wasn't right. Their face was hidden beneath the scarf, but what I could see was enough. Their skin was too pale, too smooth, and their eyes, when they finally turned toward me, were black, empty. And then came the voice. "You shouldn't have let me in." The car lurched forward, the tires slipping slightly on the slick road, but I barely noticed. My focus was entirely on the person beside me. I could feel their gaze burning into the side of my face, but I didn't dare look over. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow as the air around us grew colder. The heater, which had been working just fine a moment ago, was now barely making a difference. "You shouldn't have let me in." The voice was so soft, so calm, that it sent a chill crawling up my spine. I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that crept into every part of me. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind screaming against the windows. But the more I tried to focus on driving, the more I felt like something was terribly wrong. The figure beside me was still unnervingly so. Their hands rested in their lap, unmoving, but there was something unnatural about their stillness. The longer I stared ahead, the more I realized that the road didn't look the same. I had been driving in one direction for hours, but now the road ahead was unfamiliar. The trees lining the side of the highway, once towering and dark, now seemed twisted, hunched over as if they were leaning toward us. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my stomach dropping as I realized the road behind me was gone. There was no sign of the highway, no other cars, just endless snow and darkness closing in from all sides. My hands began to shake. "What? What did you do?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure turned their head slowly toward me, their black eyes locking with mine. And then slowly a smile spread across their face, too wide, too unnatural. It was a grin that seemed to stretch impossibly far, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. I didn't do anything they said, their voice now low, almost soothing. I just needed a ride. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching halt. I slammed my foot on the brake, but the car didn't stop in time. It slid forward, the wheels spinning, but there was nothing ahead of us, just thick, swirling snow. I turned to look at the figure, and then I realized there was no one there. The passenger seat was empty, but I could still feel the weight of their presence pressing down on me from every side. And then the laughter. The hollow, mocking laugh, echoing in my ears. I wasn't alone anymore. I sat there, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. The car was completely still now, no sound except for the howling wind outside. The laughter echoed in my mind, twisting with the growing sense of panic that tightened around my throat. I tried to turn the ignition, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. The temperature in the car had dropped even further. My breath fogged in the air, swirling around the space in front of me like ghostly tendrils. My hands were numb against the steering wheel, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could hear was that soft, mocking laugh that seemed to come from every corner of the car, as if the figure, whatever it was still right next to me, even though I couldn't see it. I glanced around, desperate for any sign of the figure. The seat beside me was empty, but the presence, the weight of something unseen still pressed against me, suffocating me. I could feel it. I knew it was still there. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. But it wasn't just my breath. There were other shapes forming in the fog. Faces, twisted and contorted, emerging from the mist. I could make out their hollow eyes, their mouths wide in silent screams. I slammed the car door open, desperate to escape. My feet hit the ground, and the snow beneath me seemed to shift, as though it were alive, pulling me deeper into the frozen earth. I tried to move, but the ground felt sticky, like something was holding me back. I looked up, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and saw the shadow. It stood at the edge of the car, the figure. No, it was there again. Its face hidden beneath the scarf, but its eyes, they were black, empty voids. Its smile stretched wider as it took a step closer. No, I gasped, stumbling backward, but my feet were stuck, frozen. "You were never meant to leave," the figure whispered, its voice like ice scraping against stone. "You should have never stopped for me." And then, just like that, the world around me shifted. The snowstorm, the car, the figure, all of it was gone. I was standing in the middle of an endless, barren white field, alone. But I could still hear it, the laughter. And I knew then, with an icy certainty, that I would never escape,